Hello and welcome back to another update. In this one, I have breaking news on the Russian-Ukrainian war as Russian forces have launched an offensive in the direction of Avdiivka. According to the latest reports from the different sources, all the reliable ones, both Remiland, Syriac Maps, Rybar and so on, are all reporting on a Russian offensive. We have also already received footage of heavy bombardment within the city of Avdiivka, here in the direction of the northwest of Donetsk. So the Russian forces have here launched a two-pronged attack, one from the south in the direction of Avdiivka and to the west of the city, and one to the north from the direction of Krasnoarivka in the direction of Stepove and Berdy. So these two villages in the north are being attacked by the Russian forces as well as the ones here in the south, and there's been heavy bombardments on the city all throughout from 5 in the morning local time. So for about 8 hours, the fighting has been going on as the time of recording this video, and there's heavy fighting in this northern direction. According to the reports, the Russian forces started heavy bombardments in the morning after a whole day of preparing yesterday. The reason for this preparation being allowed to happen is that the weather was terrible yesterday, so neither side could actually use drones to do some reconnaissance. So the Russians used that window of opportunity to build up a large section of their forces. They included heavy multi-launch rocket systems and a lot of artillery being prepared and sent to this part of the front line, as well as reinforcements, fresh units being sent to this part to launch an offensive here against Avdiivka. The theory so far as to why this happened is most likely that they're trying to either launch one offensive to capture Avdiivka in one go by going around the northern and southern parts here to the west to cut it off completely from all of its supplies and then start sieging it, or to just completely encircle it and try to take it that way. Either way, it requires the Russian forces to use a huge amounts of armored vehicles as well as infantry to start taking this. Now that they have prepared for almost a year now, building up their forces and sending further units to the front line by mobilizing and recruiting volunteers, they have now gathered a large enough army to actually start launching offensives again after the failure of the last year. Since last summer until now, the Russians have ultimately been unable to conduct large-scale offensives. Now we are seeing the first similar offensive operation similar to that of Bakhmut, and that is after the Wagner forces had left. Now the Wagner forces are returning, and according to the reports, they're returning to Bakhmut. So most likely the return of the Wagner forces to Bakhmut has allowed the Russian forces to free up some of their own forces and then send them to Avdiivka to then launch attacks here. However, there's also a theory about the Wagner forces being sent to this part of the front line to start a quote-unquote new Bakhmut. This, however, is a huge challenge for the Russian forces because the Ukrainian forces here in this area are heavily fortified positions. This is an area that's even more fortified than Bakhmut and the surrounding areas. So this is what you would call a fortress city, a much stronger defended city than Bakhmut is or was. At this point, the Russian forces are looking to use this element of surprise they gained by the window of opportunity of poor weather to then launch this offensive, which was rapidly put on its legs. We're seeing that this attempt is most likely one where they are trying to completely cut off all supplies in and out of the city. With this, we have two areas where the Russian forces will try to capture. The one is straight west of Avdiivka, the other one is to the north. If the Russian forces manage to capture the villages of Stepove and Berdishi, we see that they will be able to cut off the northern road completely, and then in the southern parts they're looking to capture Tonenke and Sheverne. With this, they will have fire control over the only road in and out of Avdiivka, and it would be a repeat of Bakhmut. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are most likely aiming for these four villages. At the same time, we are seeing a direct assault to the south of the city. This is most likely to draw the forces from within the city to prevent the Russians from gaining a foothold. Because we have seen from the other parts of the front line and from previous battles that as soon as an army gets a foothold within a city, that is when the conquest of the city is starting. Because until they get a foothold, they have a very difficult time moving through the open fields to try and get into it. But once they get a foothold, they are able to have a position they can fortify and then slowly move through, similar to Bakhmut. As soon as the Russian forces got a foothold within Bakhmut, then the slow grind began. Until then, they were standing outside of it for weeks before they were able to get a foothold. And similar to this here, the Russian forces have been fighting at Avdiivka ever since the offensive began, ever since the invasion began, and we are now seeing that this is yet another attempt to storm Avdiivka. The previous ones were to gain these villages to the east of it and to the north of it of Krasnodarivka, Kamyanka, Upitne, Robotyne, and so on, to the south and to the north of the city. Now there is an ambitious attempt by the Russian forces to storm the northern southern parts. However, this is most likely not all of it, because if they are serious about taking Avdiivka, we'll most likely also see an assault straight from the Kamyanka area towards the Avdiivka area. We are also most likely going to see heavier bombardment, because so far we have seen the Russian Air Force and heavy artillery, multi-launch rocket systems and so on. All of them have been used since the start of the morning. But similar, if we take a look at what I've been covering other than the Russian-Ukrainian war, we know from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that the Israeli forces are using their air force to the fullest capability, heavily bombarding cities to the brink of annihilation. We're not seeing any of that from the Russian forces here. If they want to actually take Avdiivka, then something like that is necessary. Otherwise, it will be a slow grind similar to Bakhmut, where they'll have to go from building to building, house by house. However, Avdiivka is actually smaller than Bakhmut, which would mean that it would most likely take a shorter time. However, the strong benefits of holding Avdiivka for the Ukrainian forces is one of them is this area right here, which is filled with high-rise buildings overlooking the whole city and the fields to the south and to the west of it. So this area here is most likely heavily fortified and heavily populated by Ukrainian soldiers, overlooking the whole area with fortifications, anti-tank guns, and other heavy weaponry. So this part here will most likely also be one of the targets of the Russian army, especially with their air force. They need to have a heavy focus on this area, otherwise they'll just end up with a lot of losses and a very difficult time, similar to their previous assaults to the northeast of Avdiivka, because they just end up being exposed in these open fields, which we have seen from the Ukrainian offensive. Advancing through these open fields is essentially a critical error for any army that tries to advance with armored vehicles, because they end up exposing themselves, leaving themselves out in the open for these anti-tank guns and artillery, as well as minefields, to just take down all of these armored vehicles. So we will see here if the Russians have learned from the Ukrainians' mistakes during the Ukrainian offensive. But that's it for Avdiivka, so let's move on to the other changes. Starting out in the direction of Kherson, we see that the Ukrainian forces made a small advance here to the south of the Dacia area by the Antonovsky Bridge. So we're seeing the Ukrainian forces slowly advancing in this direction. They have to cover the forest areas to advance slowly. The Russian forces are constantly reconnaissance active here in the Dacia area, here to the north by the Dnieper River. However, the Ukrainian forces have increased and improved their stealth capabilities and slowly advancing despite the Russian reconnaissance, as they managed to go unnoticed at some points. But this advance means that they have been shown and sawn by the Russian forces, and therefore they were bombarded by the Russian forces, but they managed to advance nonetheless. If we move on to the Zaporizhia front, we've actually seen a Ukrainian advance both to the northwest and to the northeast of Robotyne. To the northwest in the direction of Kopani, the Ukrainian forces managed to advance a slight bit, advancing in the direction of Kopani. Here they're trying to expand their footholds, their salients here to the south of Novodanilivka, to try and secure the flanks ahead of the fall season and winter seasons as they build up their forces for the next year's offensive. So far they're looking at a area where they're trying to advance and prepare favorable positions for a possible Russian counterattack in this direction. We also see to the northeast of Robotyne that they are expanding to the eastern direction as well, where they've managed to advance further in the direction of the fortifications and trying to improve their positions to the north of Verbove. If they manage to flank the Russian positions here by the northern direction, they would be able to solidify their hold here in the southern direction. So most likely they're trying to improve their positions here as well. Then moving on to the northern parts by the north of Bakhmut, the Russian forces had a small advance here to the northeast of Vesele. Here they're advancing by the railways in the cover of the forest lines here, which is much better than moving around the open fields. However, we're entering the fall season. We are in the middle of the fall season, and therefore the leaves will start falling, and then the trees will have much less of a meaning for cover due to the lack of leaves, which gives the cover. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.